Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to participate and worship with you, especially in this series for such a time as this. Our text today is one that I struggle with. I can't make sense of Jesus's behavior with this woman. It contradicts my view of who Jesus is, one who sides with the oppressed, who heals the sick, and who calls out the religiously powerful. This Jesus is one whose behavior smacks of patriarchy, ethnic bias, and quite frankly, colonization. What's up, Jesus? On the one hand, I get it. It's a bad time for this woman to be there. Jesus and presumably the disciples are hiding out in a house in town. Maybe because they're tired. Maybe because, like those of us reading Mark's gospel, they have recently heard the news of the beheading of John the Baptist. Maybe because they know Herod has heard of Jesus and they're scared he's coming for them next. Truth be told, many of us can relate to that feeling when we've been going nonstop and we finally get ready to sit down and someone pops in and asks us for one more thing. It could be a child, a partner, a student, a colleague, a coworker, a congregant, anyone. If you're like me, you may have at times dumped your exhaustion on frustration on whoever that poor soul happened to be. But Jesus, though, Jesus is not like us, at least not completely. Yes, Jesus is fully human and probably has some of the same vulnerabilities we do. In fact, scripture at times depicts some of those vulnerabilities, giving us glimpses of Jesus' anger, sadness, grief, pleasure. But Jesus is also fully divine. He has the capacity to see us and love us and be merciful to us even when we are at our worst. Jesus is supposed to be above temper tantrums. Not only that, but really, Jesus? Did he have to come so harsh for this woman? Now, Jesus isn't some people pleaser who only spouts religious platitudes that make people feel good. And he's not some passive aggressive who hides his displeasure behind a superficial smile while talking about people behind their back or worse, stabbing them in the back. Yes, Jesus uses a lot of parables, but he also does a lot of straightforward critique. However, he has always reserved harsh language for the religious and economic leaders of his day, even at times for his own disciples, but not for those in need of healing. Yet when this woman comes to him asking for healing for her daughter, he does just that. He uses harsh language. Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Jesus calls a woman a dog, and he did it in a language where nouns and adjectives are gendered. Now, the Greek word for dog, kunarion, is gender neutral, but Jesus is still applying it to a woman. So at least today, the connotation is the same, a female dog. In fact, it may be even worse because Jesus uses the diminutive plural form, meaning little dogs. Could he be including her daughter in this? It's an uncomfortable text. So much so that when we read it, we tend to downplay it or to excuse Jesus' rhetoric. We may think, oh, it was a joke. He didn't really mean it. Or maybe it was a term of endearment. But let's face it, our modern society, 21st century American culture has got to be the most dog-obsessed civilization of all times. I mean, we have doggy day spas. Even still, it is not considered a compliment or a term of endearment to be called a dog, especially as a woman. especially by someone whom you don't know. No, it was rude, and Jesus intended it to be so. And he seems to have intended it for no other reason than the woman's cultural background. Now, this story appears in 2 of the Synoptic Gospels, here in Mark and also in Matthew. Matthew's version is a little longer. The disciples are involved, the woman speaks more often, but in both versions, the woman's cultural identity is named. Here in Mark, though, it's not just named, it's emphasizes. Mark tells us not only that she is a Syrophoenician living in Syrophoenician territory, but also that she is a Gentile, a non-believer, a person who would have been considered unclean by Jesus's Jewish cultural standards. Now, we might ignore that point, except this also happens to be the first time in Mark's gospel that he identifies a character so explicitly by their ethnic identity. The fact that Mark makes a big deal out of it while also depicting Jesus as being harsh should give us pause. It certainly gives me pause. As a Black woman who is a lifelong Southerner and a descendant of enslaved Africans, I feel the sting of Jesus's words in an acute way, being as used as I am to me and other Black women being called out our names. There was Don Imus calling the mostly Black Rutgers University basketball team nappy-headed hoes and jigaboos. The New York Times referring to former First Lady Michelle Obama as an angry Black woman. Southern Baptist pastors calling newly inaugurated Vice President Kamala Harris a Jezebel, a stereotype that has been used to justify Black women's enslavement and oppression and sexual assault for centuries. This week, we've seen Olympic track runner Sha'Carri Richardson demonized as ghetto, and debates arise over whether she was assigned female at birth. Even the attack on critical race theory on the 1619 Project, these are largely assaults against Black women, against the scholarship, the thinking, the activism of Black women. Black women are often called out our names by privileged white men, but also by people of our own race or our own gender identity or our own faith group or by other marginalized peoples. We are often called out our names for people who are supposed to be on our side, but who have instead been led to believe that aligning with patriarchy, racism, classism, or heterosexism will save them. So when Jesus calls this woman out her name, I admit it, I get triggered. Just reading the words makes me want to shift my posture, to rear back, tilt my head, raise my eyebrows, and tense my mouth in a way that only a woman, especially a Black woman, could. I imagine immediately the opening notes of Queen Latifah's feminist anthem, UNITY, and I find myself suppressing the urge to say to Jesus, "Who are you calling a bitch?" I mean, really, what else are we supposed to make of Jesus's words? That it is okay to demean women or religious outsiders? It's a troublesome text. And yet there's something that draws me back to it over and over again. And that something is this woman. But a woman. When the NRSV introduces her in verse 25, it uses that phrase, but a woman. The word but occurs a lot in scripture. It's a small word, only 3 little letters, but it has a big meaning, especially in the Gospels. When Jesus uses the word, or when the Gospel writers use it about Jesus, it indicates a turn in the narrative. It tells us that something noteworthy is about to happen. And this story is no exception. It starts off simply enough. Jesus is traveling. No big deal there. He's always traveling. There's more. When he gets the tear, he goes into a house and does not want anybody to know he's there. Maybe noteworthy, but this is Mark's gospel, and Mark likes secrets. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is always healing people or asking them who they think he is and then swearing them to secrecy. I'm not sure why. It was just Mark's thing. So it's business as usual in the first verse of this text, verse 24, and it completely focuses on the actions of Jesus. Then verse 25 sneaks in. But a woman. If this were a movie, there'd be a scene change here. Swiftly, the camera breaks away from Jesus and focuses on the Syrophoenician Gentile woman. She is suddenly the subject of the story, the one who was driving the action. And what action is it? Well, first, she hears about Jesus. In fact, she hears about Jesus in ways that other people do not. Now, other people have certainly heard of Jesus by this point in Mark's gospel. Herod himself has heard about what's going on. He's heard of this man who has been healing people throughout the land. He's heard about this man that people travel out, thousands of people travel out to deserted places just to hear this man speak. So the word has gotten around. That's why Jesus is in his house. He has a hard time moving about without being recognized. And no one else in Tyre seems to realize that he's there but a woman. This woman is somehow tapped into the lines of information well enough that she knows not only that Jesus is in town, but knows precisely where he is. Now, maybe she's part of the economic elite, and the owner of the house has sent word to her. Or maybe she's part of the servant class, one of the invisible laborers that class privileged people tend to speak freely around because we think they don't matter. Or maybe she's one of the community gossips and nothing gets past her. We don't really know. What we do know is that she knew Jesus. She knew Jesus was there, and she knew that he was capable of healing her little girl. So she goes to the house and asks him to do so. It's a reasonable request. Jesus has done it countless times before. In fact, it's a major theme in Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel skips over the telling of Jesus' birth and jumps right into his miracles and his healing. Jesus heals people all the time, even without meaning to. Just a few chapters earlier, Mark tells us the story of a woman being healed just by touching the hem of his cloak. And in that same chapter, Jesus resurrects a synagogue leader's deceased daughter. We know Jesus has a special spot in his heart for children. A few chapters after this one, he will rebuke the disciples for barring the children from him. Let the little children come to me, do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Yet when this woman makes a reasonable request that many others have made, Jesus denies her. He rejects her request, dooming not her, but her little girl to being tormented by demons for the rest of her life. But a woman, this woman, she doesn't relinquish the story. She doesn't flinch. It's as if she knew what he was going to say and had her rebuttal ready. She grabs the biblical author's pen and writes a line for herself. Sir, I can hear the sass inflecting her voice. Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. It's as if this woman has crossed the gospel multiverse, stepped into the Sermon of the Mount, and heard Jesus giving his lesson on vengeance. Do you remember that from Matthew, the 5th chapter? Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Was she there? Because this woman seems to have taken her strategy directly from Jesus's words. She doesn't resist the insult, but she doesn't give up either. She turns the rhetorical tables, or rather, she turns the rhetorical other cheek and responds to him from within the worldview that he utters. And I don't think it's because she's acquiescing to being called a dog. Biblical scholar Walter Wake has convincingly argued that in his Sermon on the Mount teaching about vengeance, Jesus is not saying that people should passively submit to wrongdoing. Each of the examples that Jesus gave, being struck on the cheek, being sued for one's cloak, being forced to carry a load for a mile, these were socially allowed behaviors that had rules around their use. It was acceptable for a superior to strike an inferior on the right cheek, but it brought shame and humiliation on them if they did it on the left. It was legal to take someone's coat as a result of a lawsuit, but considered cruel and shameful again to take their cloak. It was permissible for the military to conscript a bystander and force them to carry a heavy load for 1 mile. But to make them do it for a 2nd mile, a person who did that was liable to be fined, even flogged, punished in some way. So could the woman have been in the crowd that day? Might she have known that Jesus had taught his Jewish followers to resist wrongdoing with assertive and creative nonviolence that shames and even destabilizes the wrongdoer? Sir, even the dogs, she says, strategically conceding his crass point, but finding the loophole she needed to get the result she desired. Did she destabilize his religious superiority complex? Maybe. Some have gone so far as to say that this Syrophoenician woman changed Jesus's mind, that she expanded his view of the purpose of his ministry. Makes sense to me. And there's another possibility here. Because perhaps when confronted by this Gentile woman, who is actually embodying what he said in that lesson in the Sermon on the Mount, maybe in that moment, Jesus remembers another part of what he had said that day. That next statement, right after that about the mouth, he said, "Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." Maybe what the woman did that day was to remind Jesus of his own statement. Maybe she reminded him that his ethnic socialization wasn't the whole story. Perhaps she reminded him that while his earthly existence had taught him to demean, debase, and dismiss women like her, it was his heavenly DNA that would have the last word. But a woman. I still don't know what to make of Jesus' behavior. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was a joke. Or maybe Jesus was just in a mood. But a woman. What I know, though, and what I often feel is that these days it seems like the church is also in a mood. Many pastors, denominational leaders, and regular old in the pews church folk often seem to be in this kind of mood, such that when many people come for the church looking for welcome or inclusion or healing, they might get that if they're part of the ecclesial in-group. In that case, the church might have plenty to offer. But a woman, but a Black woman, but a queer Black woman, but a poor, queer Black woman, but a poor, queer immigrant Black woman, but a poor, queer immigrant disabled Black woman. But a woman is any ecclesial outsider who pushes against the church's boundaries and comfort zones, demanding that it expand its vision of its own mission and ministry, refusing to let it shrink and hide within its institutional walls. When the church forgets its purpose and tries to align itself with the interests of white supremacist, heteronormative, patriarchal capitalism, but a woman will show up, waving her rainbow flag and her signs proclaiming Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Church Too. But a woman will insist over and over again that there is room for all of us, and that in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free. But a woman will do this knowing that the church won't often listen, that it will push back against her, that it will proclaim her a heretic and a troublemaker, that it will say that she moves too fast or that she needs to be patient and learn to work within the system. But a woman knows that the pushback will not just come from the far right, but it will come from the far left as well. And despite the pushback, but a woman will not give up. She will respectfully, of course, remind Jesus himself of his own vision. She will remind him that it was him who declared that none of us are to be called unclean, that it was him who adopted her, who adopted all of us into kinship and called us mother and brother and sister, that it was him who gave us the mission to spread this good news. But a woman will take the risk of challenging Jesus because the stakes are too high and because God's kingdom has yet to be fulfilled. But a woman will push the church because she knows that the church needs her push. May each of us aspire to be but a woman. But more importantly, may each of us aspire to hear but a woman when we are the ones she pushes against.